So what are you going to tell us, tough guy? I said, my usual. Zero, nothing.
Man, I really enjoyed your book a couple of weeks ago. Your first book, Rest. I got recommended. I can't remember exactly where I heard the news, but for a little while now, I've been fascinated with the idea of, I guess, living more intentionally, and really trying to not only work well, but have more of a lifestyle balance with, where I commit my time and the reasons for that. And Matt, you'd be the first person to be able to acknowledge and probably elaborate on the fact that all of my friends, a lot of people I associate with, including myself, far more than I like to admit, I'm the king of trying to be productive. Oh, here's our little mate. You warned me about him. Um, King of trying to be productive, but when it comes to, um, you know, being a little more intentional with what productivity looks like, as opposed to just doing more, something that a lot of us can struggle with. And I'm not sure if your dog has kidnapped you, but if
I'm here, not to worry.
I was just interested to hear a little more about your journey into the world of, I guess, for lack of a better term, intentional living or more deliberate practices with our work life.
Mm-hmm. So, I think like a lot of people who, who get into this, for me, it was a bunch of less, this is a subject that I became interested in the hard way, right? I've worked as a sort of futurist and writer in Silicon Valley for, more than 20 years now. And it's a sort of work that, as a consultant, you're always, wanting to say sort of yes to sort of the next project. You always have, clients who are doing really interesting stuff. And there are not a lot of obvious, sort of hedges around your work, right? This isn't a sort of work that ends when the sun goes down or the factory whistle sort of goes off or even the dog barks. And so, about 10 years ago, after one particularly sort of complicated project, I realized that I needed to make some changes, that I was burning out, that this really wasn't sustainable. I was very fortunate at the time to get an offer to go to Microsoft Research Cambridge on a sabbatical. And there, I did a lot of really cool stuff and talked to neat people, as one does in Cambridge. But about a month into it, I had this epiphany where I realized that I was doing all this really interesting work, but I didn't feel the kind of time pressure that I had that's, just part of life here in Silicon Valley. And it made me think that maybe our assumptions about the necessity of overwork, about the kind of sort of moral virtue of long hours, the kind of romantic quality of sacrificing oneself in the pursuit of, of a calling or, a world-changing idea or work. Maybe all those ideas actually are completely backwards. That, in order to do work that we really love, we actually need to figure out ways in which we can work more sustainably and sort of more deliberately, and very often sort of work fewer hours. And so that idea stuck around for a while and eventually, kind of wouldn't go away. And I started digging into it and realized two things. One was that, there was that when you look at the daily lives of really creative people, like Nobel Prize winners and, famous authors and folks like this, you see that they often have daily routines that are very much like the life that I had discovered sort of on sabbatical, right? They are doing incredible work, but they're also living really sort of terrific lives. And they are laboring far fewer hours than we generally acknowledge as necessary for doing world-class work. And the second thing is that, so there was a kind of community of accomplished people who sort of, who managed to do really great things while working in a very different kind of way than we do, and living what I think anybody would acknowledge, would see as sort of very admirable sort of lives. The second thing is that there's a whole body of research from neuroscience and the psychology of creativity that helps explain why these particular practices, like working in or having routines where you work in the early hours, or of designing days that are maybe that are organized around 4 or 5 hours of really deep focused time. Why, routines that do not look immediately productive, like having really serious hobbies or regular exercise. Why these things all turn out to have both immediate and long-term payoffs for creative people. And when I realized all that stuff, it struck me that there was that there was a coherent story here, well worth telling, and that it offered not really a blueprint so much for sort of how to organize one's one's own time and one's own life, but something closer to like a set of sort of principles that you could use to figure out sort of routines and schedules and principles that would work for you, whether you were a writer like me, or an ER doctor, or first responder, or entrepreneur. So that's what got me started on this. And I think that the last thing I'll say in terms of intentionality is that throughout the work that I've done since then, both follow-ups, further studies on rest and deliberate practice and deliberate rest, but also in my latest book about companies that have moved to 4-day weeks, that intentionality is really sort of extremely important, both as as a sort of source of sort of as a driver for sort of encouraging experimentation with new practices, with new routines, as a source of discipline for sort of developing new ways of working. And I think as a way, as a kind of springboard for sort of curiosity and asking challenging questions about why it is that we work the way that we do and whether it's possible to do things differently. And I think in a world that has removed the guardrails around work and work time and made that seem made inevitable and inescapable that we should labor ever longer hours and do so happily and willingly, that kind of intentionality is more important than it has ever been. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, that's awesome, man. That's a really good run over. One of the things I've found super interesting in so many different aspects of my life, I've got a background in middle distance running. I've worked in the corporate scene or I did work in the corporate scene for a couple of years, and also perform here in Melbourne as a stand-up comedian. One thing which crosses over so many of those areas or so many of those different parts of my life is that every person, including myself, at some stage, we find it very easy to ignore putting up any guardrails and just take this approach that, okay, more is better. And you touched on it when you were speaking about that, almost a moral high ground, or something which is praised by so many people of, I was the first one in the office and I was the last one to leave. We don't touch on the fact that for 3 of those hours we're on Facebook. And then the same is true in stand-up comedy. One thing I notice regularly is, this isn't to slight any of my mates, but a number of the blokes who are out there performing every single day, maybe multiple gigs a day, it doesn't always correlate to the best performance. And of course, in middle distance running, the people who do more, unless they're sort of a genetic freak, are often the ones who plateau in performance or can suffer setbacks through injuries. And it's taken me, probably the last 15 years of tinkering and listening to people like yourself to really get my head around the importance of these guardrails. And in fact, the benefits I think it's most clear to me in the sport of distance running that recovery is an essential part of performance. You're not going to run fast if you're not taking time to let the work absorb. And one of the things, even after I listened to your book, I listened to your interview, I'm not sure of his name, with a British podcaster on the way home from Melbourne the other night, Live Well, Live More, or something, I think was the name of the podcast. And it got me thinking a little more about where to even begin when it comes to putting guardrails up in my life. And one thing, which was, it's so almost subliminal, it just snuck into a lot of my day, was I would have a spare 30 seconds in my day and I might just quickly jump on Instagram, or or I might just quickly jump on and read about the local news. And it was incredible to see how much time, when I was aware of it, was taken away with just insignificant, unhelpful tasks. And I often got to the end of the day and felt just pent up and a little bit overwhelmed, like I had no spare moment in my day. But just the other day, after listening to your podcast, I came home and I wrote down about 8 areas of my life, from social media to reading news, to, you know, sending text messages that just add up to a lot of my day taken out, which I can just chunk at the end of the day. So maybe for 30 minutes, I go, all right, I'm not going to touch any of that. But the last 30 minutes of my day, I'll chunk all of those things that I've been patient. And it's amazing how much more productive, I guess, for lack of a better term, how much more focused I was from writing comedy to day trading, and just an overall sense of peace. So I guess that's a long lead into a question, because it was something I struggled with a little bit. For people who are trying to navigate this idea of, all right, there's way too much going on in my life. There's way too many commitments, and I have no idea where to even begin looking at putting up guardrails for where I'm allowed to work and where I'm not allowed to work. Are there any sort of start points that you can recommend for the people to go, all right, this has got to stop. Let's make a change?
Well, I think that there's, let me sort of, first of all, sort of, make a difference between sort of commitments along the lines of, you know, sort of family stuff, for example, or of the things that versus the kinds of things that, you know, you were talking about, like, you know, sort of checking Instagram. I mean, I think that the sort of the former are the things that you want to create time for, and the latter are things that you want to be able to be more intentional about and to have better control over. Now, I think it's, you know, when you are, you know, we often think of sort of the dealing with the second as, you know, mainly kind of sort of matters of self-discipline. But, you know, I think it's, and, you know, akin to, you know, overindulging in fast food or something like this. But, you know, it's a bit like the situation is more complicated and stacked more against us. You know, when we go into McDonald's, we are not going up against 100 PhDs in behavioral economics and food science who are crafting every meal, you know, based on time of day, what we've eaten before, sort of where we've been that day, you know, et cetera, et cetera. That situation is very much what we confront when we go onto Instagram or to Facebook, you know, or on Facebook. You know, you are essentially, you know, you're playing chess against a whole room full of really, really smart chess masters who are determined to keep you playing as long as possible. So I think that there's that we need first off to recognize this and to kind of diffuse the argument that it is mainly kind of a moral / self-discipline issue. I think that the second thing with regard to like technologies and sort of other kinds of distractions is recognizing that, you know, our relationships with technologies can be incredibly profound and enriching and sort of important to us. That, you know, when you read something like Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's book Flow, or you look at, you know, the history of human evolution, one of the things you realize is that our ancestors' interactions with and capacity to use tools was one of the things that helped create Homo sapiens. And today, some of our most profound experiences are ones that can happen with and through technologies. You read Flow, which, and if your listeners have not, I highly, highly recommend. It is it's one of those sort of works of psychology that is both very deep and very accessible in a way that can really change your life. You realize an awful lot of the experiences that Csikszentmihalyi talks about in that book involve technologies of one kind or another. And so I think that that highlights both what is at stake in making these relationships work well. It's also highlights just how deeply engaged and involved we can become with our devices. And the fact that, you know, that tools, that tools like these have now become, machines, machines by which, by which commercial entities are able to, bid to commodify and resell our attention on a moment by moment basis, interaction by interaction. This is the thing that's very new in the history of technology. And so I think learning to get a handle on that by being more mindful of sort of, how it is that these products sort of try to capture and commodify our attention, and then learning how to be more mindful with technologies is sort of an incredibly valuable thing. Behind me, there's actually a book with a red cover called The Distraction Addiction, which was actually my first trade press book, from which, I've basically just been riffing for the last couple minutes. And then, I think that with regard to, other big commitments, I think that what I have been seeing both in people who have a lot of control over their time, right? Highly creative, independent, or highly independent creatives, and then also people who are leading companies that are moving to shorter work weeks. I think that the overarching story for them is one where they're recognizing that there are ways that there are opportunities for redesigning your work days, redesigning your time, and that serve to clarify priorities, to sort of enhance the sort of productivity or the output of working time, which then leaves you freer to sort of attend to all of those other commitments that ultimately are as important or more so than whatever work stuff we have going on, as much as we like to sometimes sort of believe that or to believe to the contrary. So this is one of the great drivers for leaders of companies who are moving to 4-day weeks, is wanting to have more time for things like family, or time with their spouses, or time, sort of time for serious hobbies. And so, and it turns out that there's an awful lot of inefficiency in our working day that we can root out, that that essentially we can convert into time that is more meaningful and is more intentionally spent. So I mean, both those fronts, sort of in our relationships with our devices and our relationship with our work and our workplaces, there are opportunities to apply intentionality in ways that allow us to take inefficiency and wasted time and convert it into something that's much more valuable to us.
It's a really good point. You touched on just the importance or the reasons that people look at 4-day weeks or look at reducing the amount of work they're doing from a time perspective. And one thing, like, most husbands or most people in a family could relate to is that's exactly the same with myself. I've got an 18-month-old here now. And one of the things that I constantly noticed was just how the access to technology could so easily just infiltrate that time that I said I wanted to dedicate to, hanging with my wife or hanging with my little boy. And what I've noticed with myself, and I'm not sure whether this is a quite a common thing, I'm going to guess it is amongst a lot of people who are maybe a little more type A personality, is that at the gates, I set out with the intention of, okay, I'm going to, I'm going to have the guardrails in place. I'm going to set up a structure so that once this work is done, I can focus on these other areas of my life. And if I'm honest, a lot of the time I'll put those boundaries up and realize, oh my gosh, I've got an extra 2 hours now. And then with that extra 2 hours, I'm guessing this comes down to a discipline thing. I say, well, fantastic. Now I can edit my podcast and I can put that together. And before I know it, I've saved all this time, but that time that I've saved, I'm not using to refresh or play or recoup. Not all the time. Sometimes I do it well, but sometimes I stumble into the bad habit of going, I'm going to do a little bit more. I'm going to see how much more I can get done. So one of the things I loved in your book and heard you speak about quite in depth that I'd love to talk to you about is this idea of, and I hope I'm explaining this well, if not, please correct me, but a lot of the time when you've worked quite hard, you've created this time, it's a little bit hard to know what to do with, but with quite disciplined, intentional play, a habit or a hobby outside of the work world, it can make it a lot easier to take your mind off those things which are consuming so much of your sort of conscious attention. So, I've heard you speak about going out and taking your dog for a walk. And then I'm a big fan of Malcolm Gladwell, and I hear him speak about, his running, and Murakami as well is a marathon runner. And it's interesting. You draw my attention to it, but so many of these people who are considered such high performers in their field, they seem to have this playtime or this side hustle, which, I guess serves as both a physical release and also a psychological refresher. Are you able to elaborate a little more on the benefits of play and how play can actually serve us with the other areas of our life that, so much of our conscious attention works towards?
Sure. I mean, I that physical release and psychological refreshment is sort of, is essential for sort of both renewing, the mental and physical energies that we spend working, but it's also really important over the long run in, it turns out, things like healthy aging, the avoidance of chronic diseases when we're older, avoidance of depression in in sort of midlife and beyond. So, these are things that have payouts both in the short run and in the very long run, right? Over days and over decades. I think that what I see is that it's not that, in addition to sort of the physical and psychological benefits, that there's an additional question of what kind of thing will you actually stick to, and sort of what thing, and sort of and there is, and very often what you see are people choosing hobbies or sports, often sometimes physically strenuous, even dangerous ones, that they choose partly because they are as fascinating as work, they are as engaging, and they even offer some of the same kinds of rewards, psychological rewards, as you find in work at its best, without the downsides or sort of the long time frames. So, one of my favorite examples is mountain climbing, which a lot of people in rest sort of do. And, the scientists talk about mountain climbing as being like doing science. It's a kind of engagement with the natural world. You've got this very clear goal. You have 1,001 little problems that you have to solve, and you solve them, and eventually sort of you get to the top. The difference is that sort of the outcome is incredibly clear, and generally this is something that takes either a day or days rather than years. And at the end of which, sometimes with experiments, the results can be sort of frustratingly ambiguous. And so it is a lot of what they really like about doing science fast, clearly, and in a different medium. At the same time, CEOs talk about mountain climbing as being great because it's like leadership, right? And so it's the same activity, but people are finding different kinds of rewards in it. And consistently, in highly accomplished people who have these kinds of serious hobbies, and a lot of these people do, I find that kind of pattern again and again, right? The people choosing activities that offer some of the same rewards psychologically as work, in a different context, in a faster time scale, minus the frustrations. This is also important because at a practical level, it serves to provide often a degree of resilience and perspective. As one climber said, when you've been in life and death situations in the death zone, on Mount Everest, as he had, a paper rejection just doesn't feel as significant as it would otherwise. It's also the case, as a very practical matter, that when you have those kinds of, serious hobbies, you organize your time better. You're simply less likely to, waste time when you've got these other serious commitments that you want to get to. The final thing is that there is some interesting evidence that that experimentation in one realm plays off of or enhances experimentation in other realms. In the physical experimentation seems to enhance intellectual experimentation. The best example of study of this is a long-term study of scientists in Southern California that went from the 1950s to the 1990s. So this is a whole generation of scientists over the course of their entire professional lives. And what they found was that, looking at 40 scientists at UCLA and Caltech and USC, that over time, starting in the 50s, all these people had, they were like young, bright, promising folks. Over time, you get this group of high performers, including 4 Nobel laureates, and then a second group of people whose careers kind of stall out. Psychologically, they look almost identical. IQs are the same, performance on Rorschach tests, all that kind of stuff. There's virtually no difference. The big difference comes in that the high performing group tends to be more athletic, and they tend to choose adventurous kinds of sports like climbing, sailing, diving, or this being Southern California, surfing. And they see those sports as expressions of the same kinds of passion that they bring to the laboratory. And they don't see themselves as having to make a choice in their personal lives or in their schedules between one or the other. The low performing cohort, in contrast, does not have these kinds of hobbies, in part because they don't see them as connected, and they don't see themselves as having the time to pursue them. And so I think that what this teaches us is not that high performing people, because they're geniuses, have time for sports. It is that kind of investment and learning how to use your time both in the laboratory or the office and the playing field intentionally creates more time, creates a psychological sense that you have the time for both and that you can benefit from both. So, and then of course, the 1,001 other benefits of play in terms of expanding your imagination, et cetera, probably most people are quite familiar with that firsthand. But I think that what I would leave them with is the idea that the better you get at play in one realm, the better actually you get at play in all of them. And and somewhat paradoxically, at least at first blush, the more time you spend on them, the more time you have for them. So
no, that's a really good point. I was smiling throughout what you were speaking about there, because I've experienced so much of what you just said firsthand. Actually, to steal your direct example, in 2015, I spent a month climbing through the Himalayas over in Nepal. And wow. It was an awesome experience. But it was the first really big sort of mountain climbing experience that I had. We got to the top of a couple of really good mountains, and it was a potential qualification. I was trying to get a spot on a team to have a crack at Everest the following year, but it's a long drawn out story that we don't have time for here. But I thought I was going to be spending a month with a bunch of hippies, and because I'd spoken to a couple of the boys that I was going to Nepal with. And I got there, and what honestly blew my mind was throughout the trek, it was exactly as you said. Sure, there was a couple of hippies, but I got into some conversations throughout that month with at least 3 that I can think of off the top of my head, who, to steal your exact example, were CEOs of companies one was from Germany and 2 of them were from the States. And I had these similar conversations. I said, mate, like, how do you organize the time? And one of them said, I don't have time not to do this. He goes, I go back to work for the rest of the year. And he goes, I feel like a brand new man. And another example, which wasn't quite mountain climbing, but on the same front, was my wife and I in 2017, we walked the El Camino de Santiago from into Portugal. and one of the standout features there again, and there was a German guy who stands out to me, pretty much identical conversation to what I had with the guy in Nepal. He said to me that the year before he was recommended to go and do a 6-week trek if he could find the time. And he said to me, he goes, mate, I was so nervous. I was so confused. I hadn't had time off work for 25 years. He said, but he went back to Germany, and he said not only his wife, but his employees were just shocked at the man he had come back as. And I could appreciate it, because I was getting a sense of what it was he was experiencing. I felt like a real, what do you say? There was like almost a coming down of just that buzz that's constantly going on in your mind. And I just remember feeling a real, perhaps more present than I'd ever felt before, and thinking, man, I wish I could just bottle this up and bring it home. And I think that's what hearing you speak about rest does. It gives you some practical structures and some guidelines and some, some real tangible tools that allow you to bottle up that feeling and apply it to your own life. But it's amazing to think of it as a habit, because like anything that we're doing for the first time, it can be really difficult to know. All right, like you go to a gym once and you just get sore muscles and you think, oh, okay, well, that doesn't really feel like it's doing much benefit to me. And I noticed that in my own life. I go, okay, it's 3 p.m. I've given myself at the moment, I'm just trialing starting at 9 a.m. and I finish at 3 p.m. our time. And the rest of that afternoon is sort of dedicated to family and comedy and, a little bit of playtime. But at the start, it can feel a little bit like what it must feel quitting cigarettes. Like, something's missing, or you feel like something's missing. And even though in the long run it's going to be better for you, it can be hard to get your mind around that. So is there, I don't know if this is a common question or something that other people, or if I'm just confessing my own struggles, but one of the things that I really am glad I had the discipline to do was sort of see out that temporary discomfort or what do you say? That constant twitch that I have to just go and do something and use that attention towards something more significant. Is there sort of like, for lack of a better term, a coming down period of this obsession to work that we have, where if we're disciplined with the structures we put in place, it can start to you can start to reap the rewards?
Yes. I want to say it's about 3 weeks for essentially kind of your brain or nerves to adjust to to the habit of doing things like working in a different way, or having routines that emphasize a combination of focused work and deliberate rest, which is, I think, a really important thing. More general, and part of the reason that I say that is that it's generally about 3 weeks for any serious new habit or structure to kind of take hold and become and cease to be completely alien. That's also about how long it took me to develop my routine for writing in the super early mornings. Right? I am not an early bird, and I never have been. But when I was writing my second book, I realized, I had a job, I had kids. There was no way that I could do what I did in college, which was, open up the computer at like 11 p.m. and just go until the early hours. And so I tried flipping the day, and it probably took about 2 or 3 weeks getting up at about 5 in the morning before I really started seeing that, first off, I was kind of getting into a rhythm. My body was adjusting to sort of waking up then, but also starting to really see the benefits of it. And I think that part of it was simply kind of giving the nervous system time to adjust to operating at an hour that it had never seen unless I'd been up all night, which is a very, very different kind of phenomenon. And so I think that it absolutely is the case that this kind of, there is a kind of adjustment period, a sort of acclimatization period to working in ways or having routines that sort of bring things like rest and downtime and serious hobbies into one's life. But but you should, rather than fight against that, or see it as a signal that, or that this isn't going to work for you, or to treat it as a signal that, basically you're right on track. If you still feel that way after a month or two, then maybe that suggests that you need to make some kind of course correction. But that sort of sense of dislocation and sort of discomfort first off is exactly, I think, what almost all of us go through. So, my advice would be, don't worry about it, or if it, at least for the first several weeks. And if it gets better, then that's fantastic. And if not, then you can think about sort of what you can do next in order to sort of find a practice that really does work for you.
Yeah. Do you have a limit to how many things you allow yourself to commit to? Because I find it very, very easy to go to continually add more to the schedule, because there's a lot of things I love. There's a lot of things I love doing. And I guess it's just a personality thing. A lot of things just capture my attention. But there's only so many of those that I can do effectively without, compensating the quality of the other. So for me, in a work sense at the moment, my three priorities is comedy, I'm a running coach here in Melbourne with an online membership. And I do a little bit of work in the media just with our local sports, which is football commentary here in Victoria. And those three, they can, in fact, any of those could probably become a full-time job. And in terms of attention and in terms of how much time you could spend on it, you could just do that forever. So I understand that there's a potential risk of losing quality, even with the three. So I go, anytime I'm looking at, adding something else to the schedule, I go, hang on, Tyson. All right, what are you removing in order to do this? Have you got a few commitments that you're doing? Is your day built around those commitments? Is it sort of like a cookie cutter structure, Monday to Friday, with the commitments that you're focused on?
So for me, the times that are most structured and the commitments are clearest are when I'm working on a book. And when I'm doing that, functionally speaking, I'm not doing anything else. Once I get into it, my mind is not really that interested in taking on anything. And I've learned the hard way that's basically the mode that I get into. Now, unfortunately, the answer, what that answer turns, boils down to is the number of things to which one should commit under those circumstances is one. But I think that as a practical matter, when I'm doing that, I am still walking the dogs. I'm still doing, doing things to try and refresh myself mentally. I'm still doing the rest stuff. It's just, I'm not doing any other kind of stuff that I would recognize as work, or stuff that, has my byline, or, that I can invoice for. So, but, and honestly, I haven't thought about how many things you ought to commit to when all of those things have relatively short duration or shorter demands on my time, but I probably should. I would probably have fewer things, but I would finish more of them. So maybe next time I'm on the podcast, I can come back with a number.
I appreciate your honesty. That's good. So I'm really fascinated in hearing you speak a little bit about your writing, because obviously writing is a huge part of the stand-up comedy world, and it's something that I'm fascinated in myself, and I'm constantly tinkering with the way that I do it. And I heard you reference the guidance that you got from the advice of the great man Ernest Hemingway, when it came to, hey, rather than just grinding it out, for a few hours and just exhausting the tank, finish your work mid-sentence and come back, let your mind just play over the idea that you've been working on, and subconsciously, moves are being made even when you don't realize. In fact, Bob Dylan, who I've got up here, is in his autobiography, he speaks about how, this came to mind when I heard you speaking about just that subconscious mind working. He put it so beautifully, I'm going to destroy it, but he was speaking about how he had two songs written sort of back in the late 60s. And he's like, yeah, I'm not sure what to do with them right now. They're not quite done, but what I'm going to do. So he put the two different songs in a top drawer, and he locked the drawer and he said he's just going to let those songs speak to each other for a couple of months to find out what it was that he needed to change. I thought, what a beautiful way to think about your work, but also just, I guess what he's trying to say is exactly what you speak about, that, hey, even when you've put the pen down for the day, it doesn't mean your mind stops dwelling and or sort of mulling on the idea. So are you able to unpack that idea a little more for us and how you use that to benefit your writing?
Sure. I mean, I think that it is absolutely the case that the mind does not stop working on problems when we put the pen down. But the important thing here is that it's a different part of your mind. It's a part that is, I think, functionally impossible for us to control, whose work we cannot control. It's part of why it's powerful, but which we can nudge in, or nudge to, or to help us. To help us solve problems. Neuroscientists talk about something that they call the default mode network, which is a set of connections within the brain that switch on whenever we relax our conscious attention and stop focusing on some particular thing. One of the interesting features of the default mode is, first of all, that it switches on very, very quickly, right? Literally in the time it takes your eyes to blink, if you're in an fMRI machine, you can see the default mode starting to try to to activate. The other thing is that it likes to work to, among other things, take up problems that we've been working on, but which we have not finished. So anybody who's had that experience of trying to remember the name of the actor who was in that thing, and then the movie and that TV show, and you can't remember who it is, and then 5 minutes later, the name pops into your head while you're unloading the dishwasher. That's the default mode continuing to work on a problem even while you have been sort of focused on something else. One of the things I think that very creative people do is recognize the power of the default mode to solve problems that elude our conscious attention or effort. And part of what they're doing in their days is creating more space in which the default mode can continue to operate on and turn over problems and find novel solutions, even while we are gardening or walking or running or doing something else restorative. There is evidence that this continues to operate even while we are sleeping. Right? John Cleese has this lovely story about how when he first started writing comedy when he was an undergraduate, that he would get stuck on a punchline in the evening, and he would go to sleep. And then the next morning, he would go back to the sketch, and not only was he able to finish it, he couldn't remember why he had gotten stuck the night before. Of course, the thing is, you need to do the work first in order to get the punchline, right? You can't just you don't have the second without the first. And I think that we tend to underestimate the value of the default mode and what it can do for us at our own peril, right? We think of accomplishment as a matter of hard work. We think of success as something that comes through a combination of labor and merit. And I think that, and we want it to be predictable. And for all of those reasons, we tend to distrust or not want to rely upon, this kind of fuzzy, fuzzy creative subconscious. But when we do, number one, there are great things that can result. And number two, I think that the lives that I've studied show that even while you can't summon it, there are ways that you can design your day to give space for the default mode to do its thing in not a completely reliable manner, but a fairly reliable manner. And you can see, and I think that, in countless creative lives, we see this at work, and we see how people have benefited. And I think it's something that we all should take more seriously and make more time for.
Yeah, it's interesting that we often think it's just a modern day problem, don't we? But you look back at the Stoics and people like Henry David Thoreau, like years later, And you realize that even these times where we look back at, like I look back at Thoreau at the time he was writing Walden. I was like, man, like there was literally nothing to do then anyway. So it was easy for you to have nothing to do. But you hear him speak about just how, how easy it was for his time to get used up by whatever commitment. It's interesting that we often think it's just the internet or it's just the television or it's just the mobile phone. And sure, they all play a part, but yeah, it makes me laugh to think that blokes who are living in a wood hut a couple of 100 years ago were having these same challenges as what we are now. So I'm glad we've got people like you coming out and just providing some structure and some guidance for it. But are there like I've named a couple of Henry David Thoreau is obviously an example that I really admire in this particular field. For especially his couple of years study at Walden, just going out and trying to live really purposefully. And I know you speak about a number of examples in your book, Rest, but are there particular examples or particular inspirations that you have that really stand out to you from, well, it doesn't have to be writing, but just life in general?
Mm-hmm. I keep coming back to sort of Charles Darwin as someone who is a real model for me of both how to do extraordinary work, though I can never hope to do something as sort of significant as the theory of evolution. None of us can, but he's also someone who figured out how to do work of this quality while also having sort of struggling with sort of some demons, sort of the death of a beloved daughter that haunted him for a long time, for example, but managed, despite that, various health problems, etc., and so on, to live a life that I think is both sort of admirable for its for its qualities in terms of the amount of leisure that he had and sort of the amount of time he had for family and for other kinds of commitments, but also admirable in sort of how well designed and thoughtful and in some ways modest it was. Right? Darwin was someone who had a very well worked out daily routine that he kept to really for, pretty much for decades. And he, by all accounts, was, quite happy with that. And, in contrast to, today's jet setting public intellectuals or entrepreneurs, who can't resist a Twitter scrap or, starting some kind of public fight or, sort of anti-wokeness university, as we've got sort of now in the US right now with the University of Austin.
We're not too far behind you, Alex.
No,
over here in Melbourne.
But there is a great deal to be said and a great deal to be accomplished by by living a life that at one level is quieter and more modest, but which allows for sort of, I think, sort of accomplishments that outstrip anything that we will see, sort of, 1,000 Twitter intellectuals would be able to achieve. And so, that's so he keeps coming back as sort of the person who, who more than just about any other figure seems to me figured out how to live well and lived on the right side of history for more of his life. So many other people, like, when I was young, I grew up in Virginia, and figures like James Madison and especially Thomas Jefferson were real idols. And you realize today Jefferson's legacy is incredibly complicated, both in terms of sort of, which mainly having to do with his attitudes towards and treatment of the enslaved peoples on Monticello. And he writes really nice stuff about leisure and free time. But to me, that is forever sort of clouded by the fact that his leisure came quite literally at the expense of other people's freedoms. And so, but a lot of that, there is far less of that in Darwin's life than in just about anybody else I can name. So he also made it into his 80s. So that's you know, as I get older, that's something that I appreciate more and more. So
isn't that true? No, that's a great example. That's a great example. Alex, I've got my eye on the clock here. I told you
Sure.
45 minutes. We're already 10 minutes over that. So I don't want to take up too much of your afternoon, but man, hey, really, really great to have you on board. Thanks so much. My camera has broken, so I'm coming through the computer camera today. So I'm hoping you can see it clear enough. You look crystal clear.
I can see you fine. I can see you just fine. So whatever's happening is strictly on your end.
I shouldn't have mentioned it then.
Oh.
Hey, really appreciate your time, man. And as you said, like I'd love to touch base with you maybe in a few months whenever you've got a little bit more time and do a part 2.
Sure. No, that'd be a pleasure. So
awesome.
And thanks for having me on for part 1. To be continued.
Awesome.
All right then.
Thank you, man. I'll end the recording there. You have an awesome rest of your afternoon, man. That was such a great chat. Sorry I went a little bit over. It was the time just flew by.
No, quite all right. Not a problem at all.
Awesome.
So, okay. When is this going to go up, do you think?
I'm gonna get my act together, and I reckon I'll try and put it out tomorrow.
Oh wow! Good heavens, that's quick. All right. I will, sort of retweet or otherwise publicize, publicize the episode. Just, feel free to send me a link and, anything else you've got that you want me to, or to tweet out to my 37 followers.
Yeah, well, you're better than me. I'll have to sign up to Twitter just so I can tag you in it.
No, don't do that. Don't do that. If you've avoided it so far, stay off.
I might be able to activate my old account just so I can send you the link.
No, for heaven's sake. No, just, send me a URL. I'll take it from there.
All right, Alex. Hey, really appreciate it, man. Thanks again.